Hello, everybody. Welcome to TESOL 2250. This is week 13, day 1. And also because this is a little bit longer of a video, it's probably going to go into week 14, so I put both dates. This week's videos and materials are all intended for the week after Thanksgiving, but I'm going to put them up a little bit early, so if you want to try and work on them over the Thanksgiving break, you're welcome to start during this week as well. But just know, if you see any due dates, all of the due dates should be for the week after Thanksgiving break. So if you really just want to take a week off for Thanksgiving break, I totally understand that, and you should do that. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about rearranging core sentences, and we've been doing this specifically with questions. Now, this agenda is not organized very well. It's organized based on the book, the reference text that I'm using for this class. A negative sentence is not a rearrangement of a core sentence. It's just an addition of a not. Questions, however, are rearrangements of core sentences where we're moving things around. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about passive voice, expletives, and imperatives to include negative imperatives. And once again, agenda is not arranged very well. Passive voice is not a rearrangement of a core sentence. It's just an alternate construction. So, and we'll see this with a couple of other things as well too. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about passive voice today. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video, and it's just a little bit easier for me to kind of put all of these things together. So we'll probably see this in both week 13 and in week 14. So just a little recap from our previous week before the Thanksgiving break. There were a few questions that we were practicing, WH questions. I believe we ended on the interrogative proadverbs. So where did he take my sister? When is the wedding? And how did he go to school? I understand you guys did those. We're going to just check those off real quick on Friday when we return. And then we're also going to look at the determiners and the gen ends as well too with these two practice sentences that you guys did. Okay. So just a little side note on the interrogative WH words. When you're notating these on your trees, with interrogative pronouns and interrogative prodeterminers, we're going to write both of those as int pro. Proadverbs are the only things we're going to add the ADV. So you're going to write int pro ADV. And that is because adverbs often can be very long phrases and even, full clauses themselves. So you want to distinguish the proadverbs from just any other type of pronoun or prodeterminer, including those prodeterminers that take the place of gen ends. So just note that on your trees as well. The other thing I want to emphasize, and I did put this in announcements, is the introduction of the interrogative mood with questions. So we've talked about moods before, the main one being indicative mood. That's for assertions. Now, we don't mark that on our tree because most sentences are indicative. However, we do mark conditional mood, COND, and then we're going to add interrogative mood for questions. We're going to write that as INT. So if you have a sentence like, should we have been studying all week? Question mark. Then the verb status is going to be written like this: past, perfect, progressive, conditional, interrogative. So we can add the interrogative. Now, I've kind of separated the main verb status here for a reason. And that is because, we're used to seeing our tense. We're only going to have one tense. That's going to be first. But just as we can have two aspects, perfect and progressive, we can also have two moods, such as conditional and interrogative. The order of which you put those two moods doesn't really matter, as long as it's stated after the aspect, if there is aspect. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about passive voice. So as I mentioned earlier with the agenda, passive voice is not a rearrangement of an active voice sentence, even though it kind of looks like it is. We just call it a related construction to an active voice sentence. Now, passive sentences allow us to focus on the direct or indirect object of the sentence rather than the subject. So let's see an example of passive voice. Well, here's one. Mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. Now, this was made very famous by Richard Nixon, and I think a number of other politicians and high-ranking leaders and officials have used this sentence. Mistakes were made. Now, when we think about this, it's not saying who made the mistakes. And that's why this was actually a very interesting sentence when Nixon said it during the Watergate scandal, because he didn't want to admit that he made mistakes or his administration made mistakes. And this is one very important use of the passive voice. Well, we may use the passive voice when we just want to focus on the object, and the subject is either unimportant or unknown. Or, as is the case with many politicians, we want to shift the blame from the subject or cover up the blame of the subject. And that's exactly what Nixon did, and you know, a number of other politicians who've made this sentence. They just said mistakes were made, and who made those mistakes? We're just going to kind of sweep that under the rug. That's what the passive voice does. So when we want to create a passive voice sentence, we need to keep in mind the passive voice formula. You're going to see an object appearing in subject position. Then you're going to see an auxiliary be. Then you're going to see a verb in past participle form. And then you may or may not see a prepositional by phrase. So again, let's see what that looks like with a couple of examples. And here's some steps for how we would create the passive voice. First, we'll start with the active voice version of the sentence, and then we're going to switch the subject and object. We're going to generate be as an auxiliary, then change the verb after the auxiliary be into past participle form, and then we may or may not create a prepositional phrase. So our example sentence here is the president wrote the letter. The president wrote the letter. Now here, this is what we call an active voice sentence. Active voice just means that the subject is the agent or doer of the action, and that subject is in the subject position. It's where we would expect it to be. More sentences are active voice, and so we don't mark active voice on our tree. But we have an alternate construction of passive voice. If we want to focus on the object and disregard the subject, we can say the letter was written. Now notice we took the letter from the end and we moved it to the subject position of the sentence. This is a passive voice. Now, if I want to just end the sentence there, I can. The letter was written, period. If the person who wrote the letter is not important, I can just take that out. Or I can say the letter was written by the president. In this case, I've chosen to include the original subject, what we call the logical subject, but I've included it in a passive by phrase. So instead of saying my administration made mistakes, this would be an active voice sentence. Then I'm going to say mistakes were made by my administration. Here, this is passive voice. So we are going to indicate passive voice on our tree. It's going to be the very last thing we see, and I'll show you an example of that later. So you may have noticed, if you were looking at the formula for passive, you may have noticed there's an auxiliary be in this construction. And usually when we see auxiliary be, we know that any verb that comes after it is usually in the present participle form, not the past participle form as we see here. And this is where we need to introduce a new auxiliary be. So we've seen, if we're reviewing our participles now, we've seen that when you have auxiliary have, the following verb form is past participle. Modals and do, the following verb form is infinitival. And then we've seen be for progressive aspect, as in Maxine was taking names. Now in this case, we have auxiliary be, and then we have the next verb following it, that ing present participle form. That's what we would expect. But with be, passive voice, Now we're going to get our whatever the version of be is, and we're going to see past participle form here. So just like we saw with auxiliary have, Maxine has taken names. We still have taken as our past participle form with passive voice be. And we get the names were taken by Maxine. Now, this is something, if you're a native English speaker, you don't really think about very much. You just kind of automatically do this. And if I gave you any active voice sentence and I said, make this sentence passive, you could just do it automatically. But this is often kind of perplexing for folks who are learning English as a second language. In many cases, as a teacher, I would get questions like, why wouldn't we say the names were taking by Maxine? And, I'd have to explain, well, this is passive voice and it's a different construction here. But, folks automatically assume when they see that auxiliary be, that the thing that comes after it is going to be in the present participle form. Well, it's not for passive. Okay, so we've got two auxiliary be's. We've got the be that expresses progressive aspect, and we've got the be that expresses passive voice, and they take different participles after them. Okay, so now let's talk about a few new terms we're going to add onto our trees. So again, here's my steps for creating passive voice sentence. Remember, this is not a rearrangement of a passive voice. There's no movement, so we're not going to draw any arrows on our tree. However, it may be helpful to you to start with the active voice version of the sentence so that you know very clearly what is the subject and what is the object in the sentence. So this works for any kind of objects. It can be a direct object or it can be an indirect object as well. So let's look at those two sentences again, specifically this one with mistakes were made by my administration. Now, mistakes is what we would originally assume was the object of the sentence, but it's in a kind of an unusual position. It's fronted up into the subject position, and that's not where we would expect it to be. So what we're going to say on our tree is we're going to write gram subj, G-R-A-M-S-U-B-J. That stands for grammatical subject of the sentence. That is to say that we have to put something in the subject position because that's required in English. English always requires that we fill the subject slot. We cannot just say, for example, let's see. We cannot just say made mistakes and that be passive in English. We have to have a subject. Now, in other languages, that's perfectly acceptable. And in fact, that is exactly how you would express the passive voice. If the subject was unknown or you wanted to cover up the subject, you would just simply say the equivalent of made mistakes. We cannot do that in English. We have to have a subject. So we have to generate we have to have that object in the subject position. So we're calling that a grammatical subject. That means it's just a subject that is required by the grammar, by the rules. So if you see a passive sentence, instead of writing NP colon subject, you're going to write NP colon gram subj, grammatical subject. And we'll see some examples of this in class. Now, if you see a passive by phrase, by my administration, for example, you're going to label my administration or whatever comes after the preposition by as the object of the preposition, and then you're going to add a new label, logical subject, which we're going to abbreviate as log subj, L-O-G-S-U-B-J. Now, as we know in the active voice sentence, my administration made mistakes. My administration is what we would expect to find in the subject position. That's the agent or the doer of the action of making mistakes. So that's why we call it a logical subject. However, it's just stuck in this little passive by phrase, but we still need to indicate this was the logical subject of this sentence. Now, this whole phrase, by my administration, you're going to label that as a prepositional phrase, adverb of agency. Okay, so if you see a by phrase and it's passive voice, you're going to have adverb of agency. So we'll see some example trees with these three elements added to them. And this is one of the things that we're going to practice in class. We're going to just practice drawing these trees out. If you want to try and draw them at this time, I'll post some pages as well too. You can take a look at those pages. Try to diagram the sentence first and then look at the pages, because I think the first one is in the book, okay, in the pages that I'm going to post. So try to do it on your own before you look at the book. Okay, so it's important to note with passive voice that constituent relationships are still going to remain the same. In order to determine your logical subject, your object, and etc., you may need to rearrange the passive voice into the related active voice structure. It just sometimes can help you. Now, for example, if I have this sentence, the furniture was handled improperly. Now here, I might say, oh, okay, I see some version of be, was, and I see what looks to be a past participle form, handled. So I think I must have a passive here, and I need to think, okay, can I move some things around? Can I make this into an active sentence? Well, here we might have to create a subject, because the subject is not mentioned. And so we could say someone handled the furniture improperly. And we're going to put the furniture back, put the furniture into the object position where we'd expect to find it. I should not say put it back, because it sounds like we're moving it. We're not moving it. It's simply base generated in situ in the position that it's in. Again, if we look at my power was shut off this weekend, then I can rearrange my power, put it after shut off, and I get the electric company shut off my power this weekend. Now, if I give you the sentence, a fire was started, just take a second. What is the active voice version of that sentence? You can pause the video. So, a fire was started. Someone started a fire. So these are some practice sentences we're going to diagram as well. You can practice doing all three of these. The furniture was handled improperly. My power was shut off this weekend, and a fire was started. Okay, so I want to make a little note about passive voice. Don't confuse passive voice, the auxiliary be with past participle, with main verb be plus a predicate adjective. They often will look the same. So let's say, for example, I have the sentence, the Martinis were drunk by the characters in the Mad Men episode. Now, this is an example of a passive auxiliary be, which you see here, with a past participle, drunk. Notice that we can also have another example here where we have main verb be and a predicate adjective. The characters in Mad Men were drunk. Here, were is our main verb be, and then we have this predicate adjective, drunk. What you will notice is that drunk and drunk are the same for both of these. And in fact, a lot of adjectives are derived from past participles. We just recycle the same bits in language a lot of times. So what you're seeing there is two different trees. And you can diagram these in different ways. Now, this is more noticeable when you take the exact same sentence that could either be interpreted as a passive sentence or as main verb be with a predicate adjective. Let's take this example below. Your car was stolen. Okay, now imagine we've just gone out to eat at a restaurant, and we walk out of the restaurant and your car's gone. I might look at you and say, your car was stolen by someone. I don't know who. Okay. Now here, in that instance, that's an example of the passive auxiliary be with the past participle stolen. Now, let's picture another example. Recently, I bought a used car. I'm driving it down the freeway. Cop pulls me over and he says, ma'am, did you know your car was stolen? In other words, your car could be described as stolen. Now in here, it's a little bit strange to use was, so let's change that to is instead. Your car is stolen, meaning you are driving a stolen vehicle. Stolen is an adjective that's describing car. Here, in this instance, we have be plus a predicate adjective. Now, on your either your next quiz or your next test, I'm not sure which, I'm going to give you the same sentence, and I'm going to ask you to draw two different trees. I'm going to ask you to draw a tree with passive auxiliary be, and I'm going to ask you to draw another tree with the same sentence with main verb be and a predicate adjective. In this case, this sentence is ambiguous. You can't tell exactly which one we're talking about here. The context would tell you whether it's passive be or whether it's main verb be with predicate adjective. So we can see some more examples of that if we look at some other sentences here. My power was shut off this weekend. Well, in the previous slide, I showed that just as a passive, right? Meaning that my power was shut off this weekend by the electrical company. But you can interpret this a little bit differently. My power was in the state of having been shut off. Or you can describe my power as shut off this weekend. So shut off can actually be a predicate adjective. Very interesting. It's kind of a phrasal adjective in this case. But nevertheless, you could draw two different trees depending on how you interpret it, either passive or main verb be. Same thing here. The light was shut off to keep the room cool. This could be either passive or main verb be with predicate adjective. So we'll see some examples of this as well. And in fact, I'm probably going to have you diagram, well, I'll diagram this one, but I'll probably ask you if you can try to diagram both of these before we get to class, as well as these ones down here, then that will be really good practice. Okay, so I'm briefly going to talk about the word get. We actually use get as kind of like a pseudo-passive, and it implies that the core object is becoming something. Usually they're transitioning from one state to another. Usually the logical subject can't be inferred. So let's take, for example, my dad got angry. In this case, something got my dad angry. Or my brother got chewed out by my mom. Another way to say that, my mom chewed out my brother. That's the active voice sentence. So here we are seeing something that looks kind of like a passive. And in fact, that's often how we express passive, more frequently than the other way that we saw. We'll hear get a lot. So there is going to be a quiz or a test bonus question. I'm going to give you a sentence with get, and I want you to see if you can figure out how to diagram these sentences. So once again, just to recap on voice, we have active voice, where the subject is the agent or the doer of the action. And now we have introduced passive voice, where the object is focused on instead of the subject. Now, with passive voice, that's going to be the final comment in your verb status. It's going to come after mood, if you have any mood, interrogative or conditional. The very last thing you state is going to be passive. You're going to write that P-A-S-S, pass. You'll see an example of that on page 115 of the textbook pages I post. So here's our main verb status. First, of course, we're going to have tense. If there's aspect, list aspect. If there's mood, list mood. And then finally, voice. In this case, we're only going to write passive. We don't need to write active. Okay, so now let's talk about expletives. Now, you may be thinking, expletives, aren't those swear words? Well, yeah, swear words and profanity is a type of expletive, but not that kind of expletive. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. Expletives are words or phrases that don't add any substantial meaning to the sentence. So when you think about this with respect to swear words or profanity, you know, these words don't exactly add any meaning, necessary meaning to the sentence. They do express the ideas and opinions and emotions of the speaker, but they're not actually adding any real meaning to the sentence. Sometimes expletives are necessary to fulfill the structural requirements of the sentence. And that's the aspect that I want you to focus on about expletives. We usually are going to get an expletive when there's basically a hole left in the grammar, and we're required to put something in that hole in order to make sure we satisfy the grammatical constraints of the sentence. So let's take, for example, I have this sentence here. There are millions of drug dealers in the United States. Well, when you think about it, there is not really doing anything in this sentence. We're not saying there are millions of drug dealers in the United States. No, but what there is doing is fulfilling an important role of making sure we have the subject. As I said before, English is a subject obligatory language. We have to have a subject. And if we're in a situation where there's no subject, we have to create one. So we can't just say, are millions of drug dealers in the United States? Now, this is not a yes-no question. We can't say this as a statement. Now, in many other languages, like Spanish, you can say this. Hay millones de narcotraficantes en los Estados Unidos. Are millions of drug dealers in the United States? It's literally how you would translate that sentence. But this is not grammatical in English. We can't just begin with the verb. We got to have a subject. So we insert there. And this particular type of sentence is called an existential there sentence. And that sounds much loftier and more philosophical than what it is. It just means there exist millions of drug dealers in the United States. So that's where that existential comes from. So there is an example of an expletive. And when you see a there sentence, an existential there sentence, remember to write this as a grammatical subject. Like we saw with the passive sentences, anything that's stuck in the subject position that isn't really supposed to be there, but it's just there to satisfy the grammatical requirements, that's a grammatical subject. So you might be saying, okay, well, why would no subject exist? What would create those conditions? Well, when you're trying to create an existential there sentence, you'll see that we kind of end up with a hole in the subject position. So let's look at the steps for that. First, we start with a related core sentence. Millions of drug dealers are in the United States. Now, we move the original subject noun phrase to the other side of the main verb be. And then we end up with a hole. Are millions of drug dealers in the United States? Then we have to put in there. So the fact that there is millions of drug dealers moved to the other side of the verb be is what necessitates the insertion of there as a grammatical subject placeholder. So once again, you're going to write noun phrase, grammatical subject, gram subj, and then millions of drug dealers is going to be a logical subject, which you're going to label on your tree. Now, if you're looking at the textbook pages I posted, you'll see this tree on page 116. But if you want to try and do the tree on your own first, and then look at the tree, I recommend you do that. So here are our practice sentences. There are millions of drug dealers in the United States, and there's a hole in the bottom of the sea. Okay, so we have other expletives as well, and one of them is it. So let's say, for example, I walk outside and I look around and I say, snowing or snows. No, I can't say that. That's ungrammatical. I have to say it is snowing. Well, what is it here? Does it actually refer to the clouds? Not really. It is actually an expletive. It's not a pronoun in this instance. I'm not pointing at something and saying it is snowing. I'm just saying it's snowing. Now, once again, in other languages, this is exactly how you would express this proposition. You would just say something the equivalent of snows. Can't do that in English. We have to have a subject, so we create one, it. We also have what's often referred to as dummy do in negative imperatives, which we're going to see next. Something like, don't wear black to the dance. Now, we've seen do a few different times. We've seen do as an auxiliary that we have to generate. And there is a difference between do as an auxiliary and do as an expletive. And I'll show you a couple example trees of that for the distinction. But first, we need to talk a little bit about imperatives, and then we'll return back to that previous slide as well, and we'll kind of go back to this do idea. Okay, so imperatives. These are commands or instructions, right? So you just imagine a mother telling her teenage daughter what to do or what not to do. These are imperatives. So once again, if she instructs her and says, don't wear black to the dance, that's an imperative. Take out the trash. Or if you're looking at a recipe, mix the herbs with the spices. So commands and instructions. Now, commands are imperatives are a little bit unusual in the sense that there is kind of this implied you will before the imperative that needs to be deleted from the core sentence. So the implied you will is here. You will take out the trash. Now, why would we say that there is this implied you will that exists? Well, it shows up in tag questions. Take out the trash, will you? Notice that tag questions repeat the subject and auxiliary for emphasis. And we can see that with other types of tag questions as well, too, that aren't imperatives. Now, again, you will, you is the implied subject and the auxiliary. The other reason we have to posit that there is some sort of implied you will is that we notice that take, or in this case, take out, is an infinitival form. So we don't say took out the trash or something like that. It's an infinitival form or base form. Take out the trash. So if something is an infinitival form, we know that only a modal, auxiliary, or do can precede it. So again, this is one that you can try to diagram on your own, but take a look at page 19 for the tree. The trees for imperatives look kind of strange. And that's because imperatives lack a number of things that other sentences have. Imperatives are the only sentences with no subject and no tense. Well, think about this. The subject is deleted when that implied you is deleted. The tense is deleted when the implied will is deleted. And then all we're left with is a main verb in infinitival form. And imperatives are the only type of sentence in English whose main verb is infinitival. But there's no aspect and there's no other moods. You will always write an imperative just simply as IMP, imperative. And that's the only thing you're going to write in your main verb status. So imperative is a mood, like indicative or interrogative or conditional. It's not a tense. So we're going to write that in our main verb status, IMP. So here is our steps to create our negative imperative sentences. Now these are include not. So we're going to create a core sentence. You will wear black to the dance. Then we're going to delete you will. And then we just get wear black to the dance. Now, this is a positive imperative sentence, but we want a negative one. Well, we're going to insert not as our third step. And we get not wear black to the dance. Now, in English, this is ungrammatical. Cannot say that. However, once again, in other languages, in many other languages, this is exactly how you would express a negative imperative. You take something equivalent to not or some sort of negation marker, and you would just simply add it to the positive imperative, such that not wear black to the dance would be a fine way of expressing negative imperative. But again, not grammatical by English structure rules. So the last thing we do is we add expletive do for negative sentences, no tense. So, this is interesting. Do not wear black to the dance. Now, you might be looking at that and saying, okay, well, it sort of looks like it's an infinitival form, right? Yes, do is in infinitival form. That's absolutely right, which means it has no tense. But above that, we're going to write infinitival, and above that, we're going to say expletive, EXPL. So this is an expletive do. Now, we've had to generate do before. We know that we have to generate do whenever we have negation. We had to do that when we were talking about negative sentences. We generated do as an auxiliary verb. But here we're generating do as an expletive. Well, let's see why that is. So here's some examples of do as an auxiliary. So if I want to ask a question, I can't say, you make the cake? Question mark, that's ungrammatical. I have to say, did you make the cake? For questions. Same thing here with negatives. I cannot say, you not make the cake. That's ungrammatical. I have to say, you did not make the cake. Again, these are fine ways of expressing questions and negatives in other languages, just not English. So we say that do is an auxiliary. It's frequently generated to meet the grammar requirements of the sentence. So in this case, something needs to carry the tense, and do is doing that job. However, with do as an expletive, as we saw with the negative imperatives, we call that an expletive. Well, what's the difference between these two do's? In this instance, do is carrying tense, and there was no other auxiliary before this do was generated. Now, when do is an expletive, in this case of negative imperatives, do is not carrying tense, and there was already another auxiliary in this construction before do was generated, and that was will, right? You will not wear black to the dance. We deleted you will. We were left with not wear black to the dance, and we had to add do, but there was already will beforehand. And that's why we're going to write negative imperative do as expletive and not as an auxiliary. Now, I'm going to probably ask you a question on your final exam about why we label some sentences with do as an auxiliary and some as an expletive. So you want to refer back to this video again. Okay, so just to summarize expletives, it and there are not nouns themselves in the sentence, and they carry no significant meaning. So it's raining, there are 3 cats on the wind. Boy, that is a strange sentence. I got to fix that. I meant to write, there are 3 cats on the window. Forgot the rest of that word. So there are 3 cats on the window. There is not contributing any meaning whatsoever. But it and there fill the obligatory noun phrase subject slot. So we're going to label them as expletives. For negative imperatives, label do as an expletive. For questions and general negative sentences, label do as an auxiliary. It's performing a more important job and carrying tense. Okay, last little bit is the mood recap. So we've seen a few different moods. We've seen indicative, conditional, interrogative, and finally, imperative. We're going to add IMP. So if I have a sentence like this, mix the herbs and the spices, the verb status is going to just be main verb, imp. That's it. All right, thanks for listening to this long video on passive voice, expletives, and imperatives. And we'll probably link this to week 14 as well, too. So if we don't finish all of this in the upcoming Friday class. All right, have a great day. See you all later.